Hello, everyone. This is Kate Fowler with the South Carolina History Newsletter, and today I am so excited to be interviewing author and journalist Brian Hicks. And I want to quickly read Brian's extremely impressive bio. He is a Metro columnist for the Post and Courier in Charleston, South Carolina, and the author or co-author of 10 books. He has written about Southern history and politics for more than 25 years, including turns as the statehouse newspaper correspondent in 3 states. Hicks's journalism has appeared in national and international publications since 1986. His work has been featured on National Public Radio, Discovery Channel, CBS Sunday Morning, and in National Geographic and Smithsonian magazines. He has won more than 30 journalism awards, including the Society of Professional Journalists Green Eyeshade Award for humorous commentary and the South Carolina Press Association's Award for Journalist of the Year. Fantastic. Hicks has followed the story of the H.L.Hunley since 1998 and has had more access to the submarine and the people who discovered and recovered it than any other writer. A native of Tennessee, he lives in Charleston, South Carolina. Brian, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I was just telling Brian before we started the podcast that one of my absolute favorite topics that I've dove is it dove or dived, Brian? Is it
Oh,
dived?
my goodness. I think it's dived.
That I've dived into since starting the newsletter has been the Confederate submarine, the H.L. Hunley. And I have developed maybe a little minor obsession with this topic. I kind of went online and I looked for the best book on this so I could really dive deeper. I found Brian's book, which is his first book on the Hunley, which is called Raising the Hunley, and I highly recommend it. And Brian, I literally read your book in one day. It was such a page turner and it was so fascinating to me, just the absolute the mystery of it, the incredible layers of history woven in. It's a story of not just South Carolina, it's a story of the South, the Civil War, the nation, the world. There's so many layers to this. And so when I decided to start this podcast, interviewing you was actually at the top of my list. So this is kind of a little mini dream come true to speak to you today. So thank you again for joining us. And to kind of start us off, you were a fascinating person. I'd love to talk about all of your journalistic work. But today I'd like to focus on your work related to the Hunley submarine. And if you could kind of start us off, I know this is a big question, but if you could give us kind of a brief overview of the H.L. Hunley submarine and its historical significance to South Carolina and the world. I know that's a big question, but if you give us an overview, that would be amazing.
Um, no, I've had years of explaining that to people. Basically, the Hunley is important because it is the first combat submarine to sink an enemy ship in battle,
Right.
but is really just about the first working submarine to actually go out and do anything. They were testing this kind of technology for, probably 100 years before the Hunley. But the Hunley was the first time that it really actually worked. And, work is kind of a relative term since it never came back once it did sink a ship. But this was the first attack submarine, a feat that would not be repeated for 50 years.
Mm.
And it happened. It happened right here in Charleston, and most people didn't even know it. It just kind of went on under the radar, so to speak, back then. And the interesting thing to me was before it was found and recovered, everybody thought that this was just some old boiler, ship's boiler that they had stuck a propeller on and put in the water. And after it was raised and brought back to the lab and excavated, you find out that this was a machine so far ahead of its time, built from the ground up to be a submarine. It might have used some boiler metal, but this was designed and built. It was what I like to say in one of the books is that this is something that had 3 years of research and development behind it. This is the third iteration of the submarine that James McClintock built. And it's a fascinating piece of machinery. And really revolutionary.
You even talk about in Raising the Hunley that it's something out of a Jules Verne novel. It's something, like you said, it was so far ahead of its time. Um, I'll include in the newsletter for our readers a picture, one of the only, I believe is it the only painting we have of the submarine on top of that dock? And I kept referring back to it as I read your book over and over and over again. Um, is that the only painting we have of it? And I forget what wasn't it an
Chapman,
Italian painter who made that?
Conrad Wise Chapman. Um, and he was actually, I think he had studied in Italy. He was an
That's what it
American.
was.
And he actually got a job with the Confederacy going around uh, doing paintings, uh, capturing their glorious victory, you know, as he pitched it to them. And they would go around, and there are dozens of these things, most of them in the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond. And he did this painting of the Hunley in December 1863. And I think he sketched it while he was there on the dock. And this is in the old village of Mount Pleasant. And later painted it. And funny story about this painting, I can remember being at the Hunley lab one day before the sub was raised. And, you know, it was under the sand, the bottom of the ocean. And they didn't want to uncover it because that could lead to it, you know, deteriorating more if, you know, water actually touched it. And they were trying to cut down on that. So they knew it was there. They'd uncovered little parts of it and then covered it back up. And so in the weeks, months before they raised it, and they were building this cradle that was going to bring it up, they really didn't know what they were messing with. They didn't have the whole thing uncovered. And I can remember talking to a couple of the scientists, and they were talking about what they were going to do if the spar was still there.
Hmm.
And there had been conflicting reports of where the spar was on the bow of the sub. And
The
the
spar
scientists,
being what would insert the torpedo into an enemy
yeah,
ship, correct? Okay.
yeah, basically a big long pole off the front of
Hmm.
the sub, and at the end of it was the torpedo. And it just basically a contact mine.
Hmm.
Um, but these scientists were saying, well, they would put it in the middle of the bow, or you know, be here. And we were pointing out the Chapman painting. They had a copy of it hanging on the wall in there. We say, well, the Chapman painting, it shows it. It looks like that's a brace at the top of the bow, and that the spar is down here. And I said, you know, that painting is just, that's a romanticized view of the Hunley, and it looks nothing like it. And when they brought it up and we actually examined the Hunley, Chapman was so dead on. Every detail in that painting is correct. And we never let the scientists forget it.
Wow. That's
Everything.
amazing. Everything was perfect. Oh, I
Yeah.
love
You can
that.
even see one of the hatches is open in the painting, and it looks white on the inside. And sure enough, they had the interior painted white.
To help with
Just
illuminating the interior.
yeah, make it brighter. Of
Wow.
course, that paint's all gone now, but they found
It's all
traces.
gone. Wow. Now, for those readers who have never heard of the Hunley before, can you kind of take us way back to the very beginning? How did the Hunley come to exist in the first place? The fascinating story of H.L. Hunley himself and his collaborators. Can you give us kind of little bit of the backstory?
Well, Horace Hunley came up with the idea
Mhm.
to build a submarine. And we think that he saw something in a newspaper article. And it was some preacher out of Tennessee who was saying that, you know, the South couldn't compete with the Union Navy. And they couldn't, because it was the United States Navy, and the South starts, they don't have anything. They're not a country. And so they had, you know, kind of a ragtag fleet of ships, but they couldn't compete. And this guy says, you need underwater vessels that'll go up and plant bombs on the bottom of these ships and sink them. And Hunley was kind of this dreamer, and he saw a way to make money doing this. Wasn't a big fan of the Confederacy, but he knew how to make a buck. And so he goes to, he's in New Orleans, and he goes to James McClintock, who has a machine shop in New Orleans, and says, let's do this. Let's build an underwater ship. And McClintock really got into this, and they built a tiny submarine that carried 3 people. It was called the Pioneer, and they launched it in the spring of 1862, and they tested it on Lake Pontchartrain. And it did okay for what it was. It did okay, but then the Union invaded New Orleans, and so they got rid of it. They sunk it in a canal to hide it, and they escaped.
Wow.
They go to Mobile. They build a second submarine, learning the mistakes from the Pioneer. They build this other sub that holds 5 people, and it's a little bigger. And McClintock tried to build some sort of engine that could work with it, some sort of magnetic engine or something that would power it. And didn't do very well. They went out to test it in Mobile Bay, and they lost it. It sank.
With all the, was that the first sinking with the crew inside?
No, that was no, that one sank while they were towing it out
Oh,
to
okay,
test it.
right. And
And
if you can you give our readers too a sense of the scale of these initial subs, because it is absolutely terrifying how small the interior actually was. Can you give us a sense of that?
um, the first sub was 30 feet long and about 3 feet wide.
Mm,
So about as big as a piece of ditch culvert, you
yep.
know. And the second one was 35 feet long, and may have been even more narrow, because they found the other one didn't move very fast.
Mm,
And so after they lost that, Hunley paid for this third effort, and they built it larger. The Hunley's 40 feet long, a spacious 42 inches wide,
42 inches. Oh,
and carried a crew of 8, and 7 of which would sit there and basically crank a propeller.
yeah. And I'll include pictures in our newsletter of just how extraordinary this was, that the men inside were on um, almost little stools attached to the wall, and they were all cranking this propeller hunched over in a 42-inch wide space. I mean, these were any of the men chosen specifically because they were very small?
No, that actually some of them were a little bigger than average for the time. There were a couple of guys that were 6 foot. Most of them were 5'9".
Oh my goodness.
They were basically sitting with their feet up against one wall and their bottom against the other wall and hunched over. It's
Unbelievable to me.
extremely claustrophobic.
Yep.
When you're in there looking down that, interior, it's just, I don't know how they could have done it.
I don't either. And correct me if I'm wrong, I have yet to go to the Hunley Museum in Charleston. It's on the top of my list, but at the museum, do they have kind of a rep? So not only do they have the actual Hunley, which we'll get to later, the fact that it was raised out of the ocean. I want to get more into those details, but that is an extraordinary tank of water as they're continuing to restore it. But don't they also have a replica that you can kind of get inside and feel how claustrophobic it was?
Yeah, they do. It's actually a prop set from the Hunley Turner movie that came
Mm,
out in 1999. And the thing about it is, it's bigger than the actual Hunley. I don't,
no.
people get in there, and can sit at the hand crank, and it's just a little section, 2 or 3 seats. And I forget how big it is, but it is larger than the actual Hunley.
Wow, that's incredible. And so as Hunley and his team are putting together these various iterations of the sub, can you talk about the early kind of tragedies of what happened in the testing of it? And, I know that General P.T. Beauregard kind of catches wind of this, but he's nervous about it. And I'd love to hear that part of the story too.
Well, after after they launched the Hunley in about July 1863 in Mobile Bay, they actually tested it. They had the way they originally bombed ships, the plan was they would tow a contact mine behind it on a
Oh,
cable.
right.
And they went under a barge one day and pulled a mine into the barge and blew the barge up. Hunley came up and everything was fine. It worked. Uh, Nobody in Mobile had much use for it, but Beauregard had heard about it, and the Charleston blockade was just, they had just started that month. The Union had moved on to Morris Island, and now they could shell downtown Charleston, and they were bombarding the city. And Beauregard was desperate, and he sent a cable to Mobile and said, "Bring me this sub. I want to try this." And so they brought it to Charleston. It got here in August of 1863, and McClintock came with it. And he knew how touchy this was, and so he was training a crew and trying to get them prepared for how to operate this thing. Well, the Confederates were antsy, to say the least, and so they said, "Well, just give it to us. Let us do it." And they took it away from him,
Kind
and
of
they
before it was really ready.
yes, well, before anybody knew what they were messing with,
Right.
essentially. And so they decided to launch it with a crew of men that they had taken off various ships around Charleston. And these guys sank it at the dock. They did not even get away from the dock. They sank it at the dock. Uh, Three of the guys got out, five drowned inside it. And this was late August, just days after they took it from McClintock, who, of course, was very insulted by this and left town.
Hmm.
And so it wasn't until mid-September that they actually pulled the sub up, got the bodies out,
So
and
awful.
it was pretty bad. I'll spare you the gory details about how they had to get these bloated guys
Yeah.
out of there.
Yeah. Read the book. It's gruesome. Yes.
Um, Actually, I was there when they found the graves of those men. Their bones all hacked up. They were discovered under the Citadel football stadium.
I remember that part of the book. That's an amazing piece of this history. Wow.
Yeah, they were just lost for decades.
Wasn't it a park? Wasn't it under a parking lot, these graves?
It was actually under the Citadel's booster clubhouse on the
Right,
third
right, right,
floor
right.
of the stadium.
And
Uh,
weren't the bones all and just jumbled together in a box?
yeah,
Wow.
they'd sort of stacked them so nobody would know what happened.
Oh
I
my
mean, I
gosh.
guess they assumed somebody was going to come in there and start, digging through the cemetery.
Yeah.
But Hunley, Hunley came to town, Horace Hunley, on his own, and demanded his submarine back. And Beauregard basically said, "You can have it, doesn't work anyway." And so Hunley sent word to Mobile, "Send me some guys that know about this thing." And he took over as captain, which was a mistake because Hunley was the money guy and the idea guy. He wasn't the actual operating guy.
Right.
And so he raises another crew and is testing it in the harbor. And October 15th, 1863, they go out and they leave downtown Charleston to dive under a ship and come back up, basically just to show what the boat's capable of. Well, they went down, and Hunley forgot to seal off the ballast tank, and the whole
Mm.
sub flooded, and they all drowned, except a couple of air pockets. Hunley and one other guy, they suffocated in the conning towers.
And at that point, how many men had died in the Hunley?
13.
13 men, including Hunley himself, who the sub is named for.
Yes. And they pulled the sub up and they buried him in Magnolia Cemetery. And everybody thought that was pretty much it. And then George Dixon came from Mobile. He arrived with William Alexander, who would help build it. And they raised another crew and got permission to operate it. And they trained for um, months and would have gone out earlier, but the weather was bad. And so they finally launched an attack on February 17th, 1864, off the north end of Sullivan's Island. Went out to sea 4 miles, sank the USS Housatonic, and disappeared.
For 100 years, correct? Over 100 years?
130 years.
130 years. So I'll pause there because I want to know kind of it's such a fascinating story, and we can get into some of the discoveries from when the Hunley was raised and what we think happened and why it sank. But before we get into that, in reading your book, The Sea of Darkness, there's a book. I want to read a really powerful quote to kind of also show our readers just how important the Hunley is. And this is a quote from Warren Lash, who I hope we can talk about later in the interview, who was an instrumental player in the um, raising of the money and the logistics of raising the Hunley, of creating an entire organization around the Hunley, making sure it was safe and it had the money it needed to create the museum. And I want to hear more about your impressions of Warren Lash as well. But at the funeral, so this whole raising the Hunley was such a big deal, but as they were raising it out of the water, it kind of hit everyone. Everyone knew this, but it really hit everyone. And I love this part of your book, Brian, that oh my gosh, not only is this a relic, but it's a tomb
Yeah.
because there are crew in there who have been dead for over 100 years. I mean, it was a very solemn moment. And then when they had the actual funeral for these men, which they gave them full rights, and there were people dressed in Civil War uniforms and regalia, and it was a whole ceremony. Warren Lash said in the eulogy here, the Hunley is a tribute to the innovative spirit and bravery of the men who were in the greatest military conflict our nation has endured. The Hunley belongs to all of us. All Americans have a responsibility to preserve our nation's history. The achievement we honor today transcends geographical lines. It unites North, South, East, and West, and it spans the vast oceans that separate nations. The Hunley Project is about discovery. It's about learning what history can teach us. This project shows us what science, innovation, technology, and the human spirit can make possible. It is about courage. So I wanted to make sure I read that because I loved that. Like I said at the beginning, this isn't just a story of the South or the Civil War. It's a story about innovation. And granted, there was a lot of tragedy in this process, but I just love that quote. And that brings me to you, Brian. You started writing about this topic 26 years ago. What first captivated you about the Hunley, and what made you continue with this and writing 2 books? What first captivated you about this topic?
Well, I don't think it's that different than what's happened with you. Um, Hunley is actually the reason I'm in Charleston, the reason I live in this.
Wow.
Now, I was here on vacation in May 1996, and I worked for a paper in Tennessee at the time. I was in Nashville and wanted to come down here, and was going out to the beach one day, and I picked up the newspaper, the Post and Courier, and they had a banner headline on the front page, and it said, "It's the Hunley." And I picked it up, and that's what newspaper people do when they're in a different town. They pick up the local paper. And I thought, what's a Hunley? No idea. And so I read this news story that tells how the Hunley had been found a year earlier, and the day before, the day I got to Charleston, federal government divers, Smithsonian people, U.S. Naval Historical Center people were here, and they went down on the wreck and looked at it, and they confirmed it's the Hunley. So it had been discovered a year earlier, but I was here the day that they actually confirmed officially that it was the Hunley.
Wow.
And I read that story, and I thought, you know what? I'm covering politics in Nashville, and I hate it. I want to write stories like this.
Mm-hmm.
And a year later, I had the job of the woman who wrote that article.
Wow,
She was
that's
promoted to an
amazing.
editor and they hired me for her job.
Wow.
And I, wormed my way onto the Hunley beat and never looked back.
Wow. And in that process of writing about the Hunley, what would you say were your top three most kind of groundbreaking moments you had? Whether it was your articles or in writing your books about the Hunley, because I can tell in your books there were these certain kind of moments, oh my gosh, you know, this grave was uncovered, or oh my gosh, we discovered that the painting was right. Or can you describe kind of those top three kind of eureka moments you had in the writing about the Hunley?
Um, yeah, I think mostly they have to do with the first book, with Raising the Hunley. Um, there had been a few books written about the Hunley, but they were all based on the stories of the day, which were, wildly inaccurate. And when I got the contract to write Raising the Hunley, I was off researching in New Orleans, Mobile, the places where it all started. And I knew that one museum in New Orleans had this Horace Hunley's ledger.
Mm,
I'd seen it cited in other works, but I'd never seen anything from it. I didn't understand what it was, but it's
mm,
like, how have you got this ledger from Horace Hunley, and did it not yield anything of value?
right.
So I go look at it, and it's this little pocket size leatherback book, like you would write notes in. And before it made it to a museum, some kid got a hold of it, and it had been all colored in. And it's just, kids' drawings and just, messy crayon stuff everywhere.
What child? Whose child was that?
Who knows? Who knows?
Okay.
But so it looked, other than having his name and address in the front, there was nothing to it on first glance that was important, just something he owned. But then, I was looking at it, and if you looked kind of underneath the crayon markings, there were all these crazy little things. Like he would just write down notations about ideas he had about building a tower 500 feet high or 1,500 feet high in downtown New Orleans. Um, he had all these other kind of invention ideas, and he wrote down. He wrote down where he was taking bets with his friends about which states would secede.
Mm,
Um, and I realized that this guy is kind of a dreamer, and it kind of informed the way I wrote about him, because just seeing these kind of crazy musings of his, it was like he just saw this thing about a submarine in the newspaper, and he thought, I'll do that, because he'd been doing all this other stuff, trying to make money off the war effort. That leads me to the second big discovery was his sister's letters were at Tulane in New Orleans. And
mm.
I looked at the originals of those and found some notes in there, and found out he was kind of buddies with his brother-in-law. And he and the brother-in-law both thought the Confederacy was just the stupidest thing ever. That these guys were going to get killed, and it was, a dumb idea. But they weren't above making some money off of it
Right.
in the meantime. But while I was looking through these letters that belonged to his sister, I found one from Charleston, and it was one of Hunley's friends and business associates that traveled with him a lot. And it was his letter to her explaining that Hunley had died in the submarine.
Oh, so tragic.
At the end of the letter, it said, you know, as a keepsake, I send you a lock of his hair.
Mm.
The hair was still in the envelope when I looked at it.
Mm.
Uh,
Do you think that were you the first person to have opened that letter since it was donated to Tulane? Do you
I don't
think?
know.
Wow, that's
But
wild.
amazingly, no one had stolen that hair. But
Hair, right?
I just tucked it
Mm.
back in when it fell out on the table. But that was something. The other thing that I guess one of my more memorable moments was at the end of the excavation. We were on a schedule to get the Hunley book out, Raising the
Hmm.
Hunley, uh, in early 2002, and they were doing the excavation in basically the spring of 2001.
Hmm.
And book deadlines being what they are, I was kind of bumping up against it, and we were about to run out of time. And so they were cleaning out the last of the sub. They had dug through it. They had found the bodies and all of this stuff. And I had written a story for the newspaper that day saying they're almost to the end. They're excavating Lieutenant Dixon's station,
Hmm.
where his remains are. If this story about a gold coin is true, we'll soon know. And, I guess I could explain that for you. The story is that George Dixon, who was the captain of the Hunley when it sank the Housatonic, was a veteran of the Battle of Shiloh. And he went into this battle carrying a $20 gold piece in his pocket, and a bullet hit the gold piece and saved his life, but it warped the coin and left him with a limp.
Hmm.
He carried that coin, and he said, "This is my good luck piece. I'm never going anywhere without it again. It saved my life." And nobody knew if that story was true or not. It was pretty fantastic. It was repeated in the newspapers of the day, and there was so much uh, malarkey surrounding the Hunley. Nobody knew if it was true or not. And so I wrote that story and filed it, and it was in the paper the next morning. And that morning at about 7:30, Warren Lash called me and said, "Hey, come over to my office." So I drove over to his office, and I walk in there, and there are all these Hunley guys and an armed guard standing there. And they
Mm.
said, "Do you want to touch it?" And they
Oh
pulled
my,
a gold coin,
oh my goodness.
and they handed it to me. And not only was this a real $20 gold coin that was just indented, like somebody just put their thumb into it,
Mm.
Dixon had it engraved, and it said Shiloh and had the date on it and his initials, GED. And then it said, "My life preserver."
Well,
And it's just blew me away.
what a moment for you. Mm.
Yeah. And I remember I was thinking Dixon was left-handed, I'm left-handed, and he would stories that William Alexander told us that he would hold that coin, he would rub it for good
Mm.
luck, and then he'd
Hmm.
keep it in his pocket and rub it. And so I had the coin in my hand, I had it in my left hand, and I thought, wow, he would put this in his pocket and do this. And so I start reaching to put it in my pocket, and the state trooper unsnaps the holster on his gun and looks
Oh my
at
gosh. Oh my
it. They were kidding, but
They're
I didn't
kidding
put
you.
it in my pocket. Um, but anyway, that was a huge eureka moment that we just happened to get in time to get into the first book. And
And is it true that they then took the coin uh to various kind of bank vaults to keep it safe because wasn't there kind of a civil war? There was such a huge interest in this from the Civil War community that people were worried it would get stolen.
yeah, they were. I don't. I think those their concerns might have been a little melodramatic, but they did move it in a motorcade and locked it in a bank vault. I knew where it was most of the time. It's now at the Hunley Lab. You'll see the coin on the tour.
Great.
Uh, but I have never held it since. I had
Wow.
one time to hold it, and that was it.
One time to hold it. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you for those three kind of groundbreaking eureka moments you had. I loved hearing about those. And now we'll actually do our first reader question. This is from Alyssa in Camden, South Carolina. What was the most significant challenge in submarine creation that hindered the development of early submarines? And obviously, you've heard Brian talk about how dangerous these initial tests were, but kind of what made it so difficult?
Propulsion.
Mm,
That was the big problem. Um, Finding a way, most ships back then, they operated under sailor steam.
mhm.
You could have sails on a submarine, it operates underwater, and you couldn't use steam because you couldn't have a tailpipe. And,
Right,
if you couldn't really build an engine that wouldn't just, asphyxiate everyone on board.
right.
And that's when McClintock was ahead of his time. He was trying to do electromagnetics and various other things, and they finally spent so much time trying to develop some way to do that. They just went back to the method they'd done on their first submarine, which was hand cranks to move the
Mhm.
propeller. What what we didn't know when raising the Hunley was going on, and the scientists didn't know for the longest time. Uh, McClintock was a lot smarter by the time he got to this third iteration, and
Mm,
so the idea you have is that you've got these hand cranks, and they're just sort of connected to an axle,
mhm,
and they move this propeller one to one, and that's not it. It basically there's a flywheel in the back of the sub and a
mm,
series of gears.
mm,
So these guys weren't, it wasn't one revolution of the hand crank equal one turn of the propeller. There was a ratio to it. And
mm.
uh also they could crank it up sort of like a wind-up toy, and
Interesting.
it would go for a little while. And
Mm,
that's why you didn't see any of the submarines. There wasn't really any way to do it.
mm.
Like a move, because the Hunley going with the tide could only make about 4 knots.
And
And
how fast is 4 knots? Like,
it's
look,
about 4 miles an hour, maybe
okay,
close to
got it.
5. It's it's not moving very fast at all. But
And so,
they had to go with the tide.
right. And so how did that lead into, I'd love to talk about, the Hunley, it's ready to go. They've prepared. Dixon's the captain. They have a plan and they're ready to sink the USS Housatonic. Can you kind of take us through the events of that fateful night, what we know, what we don't know, and kind of the mysteries that we're still trying to solve?
Yeah, they had the submarine at a dock on the backside of Breach Inlet, which is the little water between Sullivan's and Isle of Palms, if you know the area at all. But it's the closest to the open sea you can get. And they had gone out some in the ocean. In fact, one of them wrote that they had been close enough to blockade ships that they could hear the men on deck talking.
Wow.
So they had gone out there before, but hadn't attacked. And so by this time, they had rigged the Hunley with this spar, which was a 20-foot pole, and on the front of it was uh, a torpedo that they actually detonated by pulling a lanyard, like a cord.
Mm-hmm.
And but it had like fish hook barbs on the end of it where they could stick it in the side of a ship and then back
Wow.
away and
Right.
then detonate it. But they had been practicing with the sub, and the conditions were right this evening, and so they left when the tide turned, going out. It was around 6 o'clock, and so they crank and go out there and they ride the tide out
Was
to
it
the
6
Housatonic
a.m. or p.m.? I forget.
PM.
P.m. Okay.
So it was getting dark. I guess it was dark by then. And they go out and when they get close enough, they go underwater. And they had spotted them because by this time the Union knew they had a sub.
Hmm. The
They had
secret was
found
out.
they had found the Pioneer in that canal
Wow.
and said the Southerners are experimenting with submarine boats. And then they caught a couple of guys who were deserting in January of 1864. They pulled them aboard one of the blockade ships and they told them all about it. They
Hmm.
said they've seen this, they got a submarine boat, it's going around in the harbor, they're coming for you. And so the blockade squadron, they sort of knew about this. And they were looking out for it a little bit. They were a little skeptical. They didn't believe anybody could get to them out there because they didn't really have anything that worked like that, and they were trying. They had their own little submarines in other parts of the country, uh, but it's interesting. About 8:20, I may be wrong on the times, but it was close to 8:20. One of the bow watchmen on the Housatonic tells his captain, I think I see that fish boat coming. There's something out there. It looks like a log, but it's
A log,
moving.
yeah. And wasn't
And
wasn't he a black gentleman as well?
yeah,
Interesting detail there.
I think that I don't know if his commanding officer, the deck watchman, uh, did believe him because he was black or because he was, a lowly, private or whatever.
Who
But he
knows?
didn't believe him. He said, "Yeah, yeah, yeah. You don't know what you're talking about," and ignored him.
Wow.
And so he tried to tell somebody else. He goes, "Look, I'm telling you, this thing is moving toward us."
Yep.
And about the time he does that, the whole side of the ship blows up.
Oh my gosh.
And this guy, uh, he climbed up into the rigging, and the water was really shallow where the ship was. It was only 20 something feet of water. And
Hadn't they
so
parked the ship there because people were looking out for the submarine and they were specifically told to be in shallow water in case they were attacked? Was that a part of the strategy with that?
that was one thing that had been recommended to ships,
Okay.
but they were also told to hang chains over the side to drape where the thing couldn't go under it, and they weren't doing that. So,
Mm.
but they were in shallow water and anchored, and but the upshot of it is that they blow a 10-foot hole in the side of the ship, and its sinking is basically dropping 10 feet. And so all the rigging's out of the water, and everybody's climbing up in the rigging to get out of the
Right.
water. And the guy who first saw it, the guy on bow watch, claims he saw it after.
The
He
blue
says
light.
he says he saw the blue light, and that is one of those. It's another one of those things that you can't prove. They did find a lantern with a lens that can be focused and shoot a beam of light in the sun. Uh, whether it was blue or not, who knows? But the Confederates in the official Confederate records, the guy in charge of that end of Sullivan's Island said that they got the signal from the submarine that they
Hmm.
had succeeded.
Meaning
And
the
it
blue
said
light would have been Dixon pointing it through
he
the
would have popped up out of the hatch and
and done a
shined toward
signal.
shore.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so they said that they got the signal from the Hunley. And then I guess there was a shift change and nobody paid any attention to the fact that the sub didn't come back.
Wow.
And, what happened to the sub after that is, the great mystery. Uh, Clive Cussler, who basically financed the search for the Hunley, he always thought that the Hunley was hit by the Canandaigua, which was the ship that came and rescued all the survivors from the Housatonic.
That's what I
And
think that happened.
it's very interesting because they had a shroud around the propeller, and it protects, the propeller from getting fouled with lines from the surface. And half of it's rusted off and gone. They never found it. But the other half that is there has got just these perfect triangles cut into it that look like propeller strikes. And also the rudder was off and about halfway underneath the sub, like 20 feet from the stern. So, I mean, it looks like something could have hit the Hunley, knocked the rudder off,
Right.
and then the sub just went down to the bottom and rested on top of it. I don't
Hmm.
know how it would have gotten under there otherwise. But they were going to have to go down and wait for the tide to start rolling in anyway. So they had to wait it out. But if they lost their rudder and had no way to steer, that's exactly what they would have done. Otherwise, they would have kept drifting out to sea.
Right.
But yeah, the upshot was that they settled on the bottom at 27 feet of water and just never came back.
And
And
what's
that's,
amazing. Oh, sorry, keep going.
I was going to say, the interesting thing about it is people were looking for the Hunley from the end of the war on. And the reason they never found it was everybody started their search from the wreck of the Housatonic and worked their way back towards shore. And the Hunley
Mm-hmm.
was a quarter mile farther out to sea by that time because the tide had pulled it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that saved it.
Yeah, and just reading in Brian's books about the forensic science that's been a part of these efforts to understand the mystery of what actually happened, down to the how the bodies, you know, what the bodies, how the bones settled in the submarine to, one person's body language looked a certain way as they were kind of pushed backwards. So somebody thinks that the kind of isn't there another theory that when they hit the Housatonic, the whole submarine was kind of pushed backward and there might have been damage to the submarine that started the process of water coming inside of it. So the forensics of this are so fascinating to me because down to, the positioning of the bodies inside of the submarine to the impact and the angle of this and we can't know for sure, but I'm just fascinated by that. And I don't know if you wanted to talk about kind of the scientists you've met in this process and what it's been like for you to visit the lab and kind of hear them talking about the various theories. I'd love to hear that part of the story as well, like your interactions with the scientists.
Um, I have a good relationship with all the scientists, the archaeologists and the conservators, which are the main two branches dealing with that, or fields of expertise, I should say. And they're pretty funny about it. They won't pinpoint anything. Because there's no smoking gun. You have to look at the evidence and extrapolate it out. And they're not big on extrapolating, especially not off the cuff.
Right.
Uh, but Paul Mardikian, who's the first conservator on the Hunley, he showed me just before Sea of Darkness came out.
Mhm.
He showed me the intake valve for the ballast tank and how it had been broken.
Hmm.
And he thinks that when the Hunley collided with the Housatonic, he thought that maybe one of the crewmen had been knocked against this pipe and busted it, which
Mm.
would have put a fair sized little hole in the sub, and that's how water got in there, and that,
Mm. Got it.
something.
Really interesting.
I don't know. They go back and forth. For a while, they thought that, and I suppose they still do, at least part of the Hunley was not filled with water for a long time after it sank. There were stalactites hanging off the ceiling, which are
Right. I forgot
formed
about that.
from dripping water. So
Hmm.
they're not going to form underwater. So water was dripping off the roof inside that caused these to form. And I think it was probably just an air pocket, or maybe they were dry for years, or at least partially dry for years. But at some point, uh, there got to be a few holes in the sub
Mhm.
that led to, all this silt and sand pouring into part of it.
Right.
And, you know, not sure if scouring sanded down these holes and these weak spots. Uh, the hole in the conning tower could have been made by an anchor or something dragging on the ground that snagged
Mm.
it.
Hmm.
The other two holes are on the flank where the metal sort of bends, where there's sort
Mm.
of tapering it toward the end. So that was going to be the thinnest metal anyway. And it looks like it may have just scoured.
Mm.
Um, that it just
Wow.
over the years.
Yeah. And can you talk about the whole process of, okay, wow, I mean, we don't have time, unfortunately, to talk about all the various attempts and discover, this person who said they found the Hunley first, and it's incredible. Everyone needs to read Brian's books about this because that part of the story is riveting too. Amateur divers, professional divers, archaeologists, everyone's trying to find it. But can you talk a little bit about once they truly discovered it? Talk about kind of the forces that came together, Warren Lash, Clive Cussler, that there was almost a fight as to who was going to own the Hunley, who was going to keep it, what museum was going to keep it? Was it the Navy's? Was it South Carolina's? Was it New Orleans? There was almost a fight to have not ownership, but who was going to claim the Hunley. And I thought that was fascinating. If you could talk about that and then just how it got out of the ocean, the incredible process of organizing all that, and making sure it was kind of that state of the art company they used, and you were there the day it was raised. What that was like. Can you kind of take us through all of that and kind of drama of raising the Hunley itself?
Yeah, that was a fun time because after Ralph Wilbanks found the Hunley for Clive, uh, they wouldn't give anybody the coordinates because Clive came to town from his home in Colorado when they found it. And Ralph had already had run-ins with some of these treasure hunters who were looking for it. And so they didn't want to tell anybody where it was.
Mm-hmm.
And the state government came in, demanding the coordinates. The federal government claimed they owned it as the spoils of war. And Clive, the rich guy doesn't have to do anything. Just said, I'm not going to tell you until I see something, until I see that you
Like a
clowns
plan,
can actually do this.
right?
And eventually they negotiated a settlement. I mean, there were some of the hotheads in South Carolina State House were talking about having Cussler arrested until he turned over the coordinates. It was funny. It was, uh, in retrospect, it's comical. But I was with Ralph and Warren and Glenn this past weekend, and
Oh,
when they found the Hunley, um, they got to it and they went down. What they uncovered was the front conning tower. They found that hole in it.
mm,
And Clive said, you got to go back and put something there so everybody knows we were there first. And so they wrote this note and they laminated it and they took it back down and they put it inside the Hunley in that hole in the conning tower. Well, uh, when the state finally negotiated the settlement and took control of it and got the federal government to back off, which they did using Strom Thurmond, and they raised it. course, one of the first things they get out of it is the letter. Well, Ralph wants the letter back, and McConnell won't give it to him, or he can't now. But I mean, he said at the time, he goes, "No, no, no, this is an artifact of the Hunley now. You can't have it." And so every time Ralph and Glenn are around each other, Ralph is hounding him for that letter.
Oh my gosh. And is that letter now behind glass at the Hunley Museum or something?
It's somewhere in the state archives. I really don't know.
Wow. Wow.
I
And
don't think
then,
I've ever seen the actual letter.
oh my gosh. And then Brian in his book talks about how, you know, the most state of the art uh, companies had to be hired to rig the submarine with these incredible contraptions and braces and special substances that would kind of mold to the body of the submarine. And so, what was it like to watch this process and then finally see it coming out of the water for the first time? What was that like for you?
Uh, it was by that time, by the time they raised it in August of 2000, I was so obsessed with this. I was afraid something was going to happen. I wasn't going to get to see it. And but it was drama right up until the last moment. They decided, we can put this cradle over it and then strap it in. They were very worried about twisting the sub. They were worried about moving the placement of artifacts inside it. They were worried about anything that would put stress on the hull. And I mean, their worst nightmare was pulling this thing out of the water and breaking it too, and everything goes spilling into the
And all
ocean.
the bodies just spilling out of
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
And they were just scared to death of this. So they came up with this idea to basically burrow under the Hunley and strap it and put a strap. The straps were pretty much right next to each other. There may be an inch or two clearance between them, but the straps had pockets in them where they could put this foam
Hmm.
in it that would harden and conform to the shape of the sub without hurting it. And they had all this ready to go, and then they were going to pull it up. And then the weather gets rough, and they're worried that their boat won't do it, that it's not stable enough. They say we need a crane barge with legs that can stand in the ocean, and they had to find one of those. And Warren had found one in Louisiana, and he still talks about being on the phone with this crazy Cajun woman who was trying to hit him up for all this money. And they finally found one that would do it, and it was in the Dominican Republic, and it couldn't work in the
Wow.
States until they reflagged it. And hurricane season starting, so there are all these
Mm,
time crunch elements. But they got it there, and it went off without a hitch. And
mhm.
they were doing what they were supposed to do. They were being overly cautious. The Hunley
Yeah.
wasn't quite as fragile as they feared,
Mm.
but they raised it up, and it went off without a hitch.
And were you there with Warren Lash and the team? Were you on the same boat when they raised it?
No, I was not. We were doing newspaper work that day, and my partner, Skylar Croft, was out there on the boat, and I was at the lab. Actually, I
Okay.
was I was all over town. I
Hmm.
was kind of following the parade as they brought it into the harbor and up the river.
Yeah.
But I was at the dock when the Hunley landed.
Got it.
And then I walked into the lab with it, with the whole process of moving it into the lab. So where it sits right now, I was there the day we moved it off the barge into there,
Hmm.
and in fact was in the way so much I'm in the newspaper photos.
Yay. And apparently, when they raised it, out at sea, what would you say, 4 miles out at sea? What was it
Yeah,
again?
yeah, about four
Um,
miles offshore.
when they raised it, uh, there were hundreds of boats surrounding the area watching this huge historical moment. And actually, interesting factoid, I interviewed John Scherer, who's the director of preservation at Historic Columbia, for my podcast last week, and he was there. He was on a boat that morning watching this happen. So between you and him, I'm seeing the different views of this historic day. And
There
so,
were so many people out there.
yep,
There were thousands.
yeah,
They even took
wow.
out, like the Fort Sumter tour boats, the double
Hmm.
deckers that take people out to the fort.
Hmm.
They had one of those out there. Uh,
Wow.
there are some photos when it came out of the water that it was just surrounded by boats. It was almost like
Wow.
an amphitheater for people to watch it.
It's
But yeah,
incredible.
I know. I've got several friends who took their own boats out there.
Yeah.
Probably had business being 4 miles offshore, but we're out there nevertheless.
Um, and I kind of zooming out, and we'll talk more at the end of the interview about how we can all support um, kind of your efforts regarding the Hunley and your other work. And I'd love to hear more at the end about the Hunley Museum and how the submarine's currently being preserved and its tank of water, which is so interesting. But kind of zooming out, Brian, what have you learned about South Carolina, its people, its culture, and more as you have uncovered the story of the Hunley? And I know we said, this is an American story, it's an international story, yes, but because this is the South Carolina History Newsletter, are there certain things that you really discovered? And I know you've made Charleston your home in the process, but do you have any comments about that and kind of the spirit of the people of South Carolina and the culture as you've worked on these projects for the Hunley?
Uh, I'm not sure how to answer that. It was kind of interesting to me. Uh, the South Carolinians have sort of seen it all. I mean, I wrote a book about the war in Charleston, just from the point of view of Charlestonians, and they were all standing out on the battery when Fort Sumter was shelled, the opening shots of the war,
Mhm.
and most of them were standing out there griping that it was taking too long.
Oh
Uh,
my gosh.
but the thing that's Charleston. But the thing that struck me about the people during the Hunley was that everyone knew that this top secret thing was going on, and half the city had seen it out there, you know, in the harbor. Nobody talked about it. Nobody said anything. All very, very hush hush about it. And I don't know if it was just, one of 100 crazy things they were seeing during the war or what, but it took those deserters to sort of tip off the Union. There wasn't anybody talking about it. The newspapers kept quiet about it.
Mm.
Uh, even the announcements when Hunley sank the sub, and when the first crew died at the dock, the newspaper had very vaguely worded descriptions of what happened so as
Hmm.
not to tell anyone about their secret.
Mm, right.
And I thought that was sort of interesting, the whole city sort of being like that. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely. Love that. All right, so we're going to move into a fun part of the interview, last part of the interview, which is what I call our Carolina questionnaire. And I'm going to ask you a couple fun questions, kind of zooming out a little bit about South Carolina and our history a little bit. But the first question is, which historical figure, Brian, from South Carolina, history or present day, would you most like to have dinner with and why?
uh, from South Carolina, that
Yes.
that precludes everybody in the Hunley story pretty much.
Well, actually,
I
no. Let's say people. So it can be a historical figure who came to South Carolina, but who became a part of the history of the state. We can say that. That's fine.
Well, in that case, I would say George Dixon because we still don't know anything about him. Not
Yeah.
even really sure where he's from.
Hmm.
Uh, but he's one. Judge Wady Swearing, I wrote a book about him. I would really like to talk to him more about what made him launch this crusade that led to Brown versus Board of Education.
Hmm.
Uh, well, we've got our share of characters, but yeah, I think those guys that could answer questions for me would be the.
Nice. And then if you could go back in time to any period in South Carolina history and be immune from any danger, when would it be and why?
I think 1920s or 30s, uh, probably Charleston, right when the city was sort of trying to become a tourist town, and that's just my favorite period in history. That's the history that I like writing about the most. Uh, the Hunley was a bit of a misnomer because the militaries kept such good records and wrote down everything. But researching books, researching 19th and especially 18th century history is a huge hassle. Early
Mm,
20th century was like the dawn of bureaucracy. You could find anything from then. And for whatever reason, that's sort of just become my period.
love that. What is the most surprising thing you've learned about South Carolina history along the way?
Uh, that this little state has made a huge difference in this country's history. And I don't think many people understand just how much history there is here. Uh, you know, going back, not only the Revolutionary War, I think doesn't
Yep.
happen without our people here.
Mm-mm. Yep.
The nullification crisis, of course, we started the Civil War, that one's on us.
Hmm.
Uh, but and then going to Waring, the most monumental Supreme Court decision of the 20th century was basically cooked up in a Charleston courtroom.
Mm,
Uh, just everywhere you turn, South Carolina has had a hand in all of this history, whether it's, all these Revolutionary War battles in the upstate that were, decisive. And I don't, it's this state has more than its share of American history.
absolutely.
I
All
never,
right. Favorites. Sorry, keep going.
no, I said I didn't know that until I moved here.
Yeah, I certainly didn't know the Revolutionary War history and how those decisive battles happened here and were instrumental in our eventual victory. I had no idea. So it's really amazing. And now there's a big billboard on I-85 from the South Carolina 250th Committee that says, "The revolution was won here." And I was like, wow, that's awesome. What is your favorite South Carolina history book or movie?
uh, a book, probably got to go with Walter Edgar's, history of South Carolina. Walter's a friend of mine, and he has written the King James version of our history.
Yes.
Uh, if you cannot lift Walter's book to read it, I suggest The Water is Wide, Pat Conroy.
Mhm.
That's a good one. More recent history.
Love that. Yeah. Um, Also, my guest last week, John Scherer, Walter Edgars was his thesis advisor, and he said the exact same book you did because he loves Walter. So I love that. I love that I've got a double Walter. I need to get him on the show soon, very soon, I hope. Favorite South Carolina food or dish?
Crip and grits.
Love it. Favorite South Carolina festival or event?
Wow, I don't get out much. The only one I know that I go to is the Coastal Carolina Fair,
Oh,
which is, great, great fun. I think it
is
costs
it
more than going to Disney, but it's fun.
is it like a regular kind of like amusement, Ferris wheel
It's
and all
like
that? Or
it's like the state fair. It's just for the low country.
nice.
You know, questionable rides. Uh,
Questionable, right?
yeah.
And what is a must-visit place in South Carolina for history buffs?
The obvious answer is Fort Sumter, I think, but I've got to go with the Aiken Red House,
Okay.
which is probably the most complete urban plantation that we still have, or that much intact.
Mm.
I don't know if you've ever been there, but
I
it's pretty.
haven't. It's on my list. I can't wait.
It's I mean, it still has some of the outbuildings, you know.
The slave kitchens sort of thing.
Yes,
Yeah.
those it's still got all these buildings and its wall
Wow.
and the house is really great. It's just in the middle of downtown Charleston in a neighborhood, and they filmed Swamp Thing there 45 years
Swamp
ago.
Thing.
Yes, I've never seen the movie. I don't know, but they also say it's haunted.
Oh, okay. Wow.
So it's got all
Wow,
kinds
that's awesome.
something for everybody there.
Yes, absolutely. So we're going to wrap up our interview, but a couple more questions. Can you tell us, Brian, about any of your future projects in the pipeline? You've written 10 books. I feel like you've got many more to come. What are you working on now?
Uh, Not really working on a book at the moment. I toyed with the idea of doing a Revolutionary book, but the
Mm,
whole 18th century research thing sort of got me down. Uh, we had an option to turn uh, in darkest South Carolina, the book about Judge Waring. Warner Brothers had optioned it for a movie or a TV show,
mm,
and uh, that fell through. Warner Brothers got sold for the 50th time in the last 3 years.
okay.
But we're still kind of working on that. So that's part of what I'm doing.
Well, my big question, Brian, is can we please make your books about the Hunley into a movie? I know it was made into a TNT, like made for TV movie, but like we need to make this into a major blockbuster. Like, oh, can't you see it? See it.
I know some people who would like that idea very much.
Oh, it would be amazing. I feel like we're entering into a time in I feel like the culture tides are changing and you know delving deeper into the Civil War and what happened and I just feel like this is going to become a topic it's going to pop up and become something big. So anyway, I'm rooting for this to become a major motion picture. So you have my vote. Um, and then
That
can
would
you
be
tell
great.
us a little bit about kind of if our readers want to come to the Hunley Museum, which is on the top of my list for this fall, what would be your what are the must see parts of the museum? Is there a certain kind of way that you would recommend someone goes through it? What would be the ideal experience to see the Hunley for yourself and to feel that history?
Well, just be sure that you take enough time when you go there. I think the tours are sold every 20 or 30 minutes, but there's so much that's not in the part that you need the ticket to get into. Uh, there's a whole kind of open area. The timed entry is to get in to see the actual submarine and the gold coin and
Mhm.
some of Dixon's other stuff that was in his pockets. Those are the things that are, excuse me, really kind of time sensitive. But the rest of the museum, they've got artifacts from the raising. They've got, you know, the dive suit Harry Pecorelli was wearing when he first put his hands on the Hunley. They've got molds of the crew that show you what these guys look like. You know, that forensic scientists basically built out
Yeah.
of molds of their skulls. Uh, and like I say, they've got the props from the movie there and stuff. But there's just so much you can see. You could take hours absorbing all of this little artifacts through Hunley history.
Mhm.
Uh, I was just there this past weekend, and They've got a deck cannon from the Alabama
Oh,
that
wow.
got sent there 20 years ago to be conserved, and they just, basically let them keep it.
Oh,
And so
wow.
there's all kinds of artifacts, and when they build a museum, you'll see more of this stuff fall out. But
Oh,
there's a
so
lot
this
to do there.
this won't be the final resting place for the Hunley?
They want to build a museum uh,
Mhm.
where you'll be able to see the Hunley better than you can
Okay.
see it now, and like in a humidor where
Hmm.
you can walk all the way around it. Look,
Sure.
uh, but that's years off. I think the
Hmm.
scientists last said that it's got about 4 more years of soaking, and I don't know how much time it's going to take the politicians to get all the deals in place and get a museum built, or where it's even going to go. That's sort of changed over the years.
And I'll put a picture in the newsletter, but can you describe to people how the Hunley is currently being restored within this kind of saltwater bath? It's just so interesting, and why they've done that.
Uh, well, the Hunley, the metal, it just absorbed all this salt over 130 years of being underwater. And so they're having to use chemicals to sort of draw that out to stabilize the metal. Uh, and so it's kind of it's in this big long tank. I guess the tank's probably 60, 70 feet long, and probably 15 feet deep. But it's been sitting in that same tank uh, since the day it was raised. And it used
How
to,
long ago is that now?
24 years.
Wow.
Just last month was the anniversary, 24 years. But it was forever, it was in the lifting cradle that it was in when they brought it up. And they
Hmm.
finally got rid of that. And it's now sitting upright
Mm.
in there. And it stays in this caustic chemical that's pulling that salt out.
Hmm.
And so when you see it, it's underwater. But they've upgraded the lighting. I thought, oh, this is great. This is new. I mentioned it to somebody else, and they said, yeah, we did that 2 years ago. But it lights up and highlights parts of the sub, and you can really see it well now because it's upright. And there are a few of the hull plates that they've taken off of it that they did during the excavation, and you can see down in there. And now that all of this concretion and the sand and shell is off of it,
Hmm.
it's unreal. You can actually see what it looked like
Mm.
in the 1860s, and it looks like the Chapman painting. And Glenn McConnell and I went up and looked at it Saturday morning, and we're just kind of marveling at how much it looks that way, because we had never looked at it together since then.
Hmm.
But so it's in this tank in water. You're looking down at it, and they hope to have it where you can walk right up to it at some point, in a museum. But that's how you look at it now. We used to, for years, uh, I would go down in the tank when they had it drained,
Hmm.
and walk around it, look in it, and I never quite climbed in it like
Hmm.
Warren has, but uh, you can stick your head in there. And a buddy of mine took my picture from one end of the sub that looks like I'm in the sub because I'm leaning into it.
Right.
But now you can't do that. It's even you can't even really touch the sub. Those chemicals are so caustic that it just really eats your skin alive.
Oh my gosh.
So when we were up
Well,
there taking photos for a new edition of Sea of Darkness, the photographer could go down in the tank in a special suit, but they just told me, you got to stay up here. You can't go.
oh my gosh, that's wild. All right, so Brian, how can people support the great work you're doing, whether it's a new book in the future or your journalism endeavors? How can we support your work?
Uh, I don't know. read the Post and Courier, or my books are, most of them are available on Amazon. Really good deal that some people might be interested in.
Mm-hmm.
This past weekend, we did a book signing at the Hunley Lab for Sea of Darkness. We do this for them every now and then, but when I go in to do this, we bring in all these people from the story's history: Ralph Wilbanks, Warren Lash, and Glenn McConnell.
Mm-hmm.
And so right now, if you go on Friends of the Hunleys website, you can order a copy of Sea of Darkness signed by all of them,
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
which I think is pretty neat. It's you can always find a book signed by the author, but how often can you find a book signed by the characters in the book?
I love that.
And so they go in and do that every now and then, and I like to take them with me because people really want to talk to them.
Absolutely.
It's
Love that.
fun.
Well, Brian, thank you so much once again for joining me for our podcast today. It was such an honor, and it was so exciting to talk to you after reading your books, loving your books, becoming obsessed with the same topic as you have, dived into it throughout your career. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us, and we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on. It's good to talk to you.